I'd like to formally welcome everybody to the Linux workshop, Learning Linux, sponsored by APCUG. We're going to be here for the next couple of hours today doing a more of a general introduction to Linux. And as you saw on the slideshow, we have 3 more workshops coming up, one in November and 2 more in December that will go more in depth on different topics. We hope that you will be able to join us for the other 3 sessions. If the name that you have listed in the participants or on the screen that we can see is not the name that you use to sign in to the registration, we won't be able to match up your name with your email to send any kind of follow-up that we might have the video. So if you have a name that we're not going to be able to find, please change that so that we can match you up and get sent out. Unfortunately, for many of the workshops for Bill and for Kenneth on Bitwarden, we did not get things sent out because we couldn't match them up. At this time, our team is Orv Beach, who is a very big Linux specialist from Southern California, and also Sharan Kalwani, who's from my region. I'm the regional advisor for regions 3 and 6, and Sharan's from my Michigan group. And each of us will be taking a little share today to present some information on what is Linux, what are the benefits of Linux, and the third part about why are there so many. So if you haven't given us name, please send that in. And at this time, I'm going to turn things over to Orv. And as I said, if you have questions during his presentation, please send those to Bill James. And then after he's done, Bill will share those questions. Okay, Orv, if you want to go ahead and share your screen and take over things.
I will, thanks. You can hear me okay, right?
Good.
All right, let me see if I can get this puppy going. You see that, Bill?
Yeah, you're good.
See that, John? Yeah,
Yep.
Sorry. Okay, thanks to APCUG for letting me present. I like Linux, I love Linux, and I enjoy talking about it, so this is not a task, it's something very enjoyable. Anyway, my name's Orv. John gave me a very nice introduction. I've been messing around with Linux since it started almost, I guess, and finished up my career as a senior Linux system admin. So anyway, some things about Linux. It's the real technical name for Linux is GNU Linux. Linux is actually the name of the kernel. GNU is pretty much the assortment of libraries and utilities that are associated with it. When you talk about putting Linux on your computer, you're actually putting in a Linux distribution. What's a distribution? It's all the software that comes on the CD or thumb drive in the image. And I might mention that the compilers of that distribution have to make sure that all the stuff is integrated well. It's like assembling a car, I guess. Anyway, in the distro is the operating system and drivers. In the early days, the number of hardware devices that Linux supported was fairly limited. So it made getting it installed a challenge because it wouldn't fail. We'd have an install fest, and the computer we're trying to install it on had a CD-ROM drive or a funky floppy drive, and we couldn't do it. Back then, it was a challenge to get it installed. All of those issues have completely gone away because there are drivers for a universe of hardware now available for Linux. Also, those utilities and libraries and the other stuff that makes up a real operating system. And in most cases, the UI, user interface, is known as a desktop environment. That's all those neat graphics and graphical utilities and even applications. Desktop applications will always have at least one DE provided, but there are specialized Linux distributions, like a file server might not come with a desktop environment, or it might be supplied but it won't start at boot time. And there are rescue disks. Typically you boot on those to rescue a clobbered Windows disk, or any kind of disk for that matter. And you get some applications with it. What you get varies on the distribution, but there's a very common set of applications that comes with each Linux distribution. Linux started out as a hobby system in actually '91, gaining popularity very steadily, and in the 2000s it spread rapidly. It's almost universal now. More than 90% of the public clouds. And by the way, you have to remember that the definition of cloud is somebody else's server. So keep that in mind when you store vital information up in the cloud. You're depending on them to have reliable backups. Always have an extra backup. Anything around the house you have that has wireless access built in, almost guaranteed to be running Linux. Back when they started providing electronic things 20 years ago, Microsoft required, I think it was $60 for each license for every system. And if you're selling a little electronic widget for $20, $30, $40, that 60 bucks would make your selling price non-competitive. So a lot of those, and over time, all of those vendors turned to Linux because there was no licensing fee. Additionally, Linux is highly modular, and it can be trimmed down to suit the target system. I mean, you wouldn't expect a desktop environment to be included with a smart thermostat. So they can trim it down and make it very, very small. About 20 years ago, the first supercomputer vendor tried using Linux and found out that it works fairly well. And again, free for licensing and very flexible, could be configured for their hardware. Over time, all 500 of the top supercomputers now run Linux. I think the last one was displaced by Linux, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago. And more than 80% of smartphones run a Linux kernel. Not all of the applications are open source or Linux based. A lot of them are Java based, but every Android phone runs a Linux kernel. And most corporate servers run Linux. Could be Red Hat, could be SUSE. And the reason they run those versions is because while Linux is free, they make their money through support. And running a large server farm in a large company, you want somebody you can call 24/7 if there's problems. So the way those companies survive is by providing service. But we're here to talk about Linux on the desktop, so let's do that. So let's talk about Microsoft Windows. So with Windows, you get the Windows OS and your choice of desktop environment. You get your choice of Windows, or well, Windows, or Windows. And that's what they do. With Linux, you can get your choice of a user environment, desktop environment. And there are literally dozens, but a lot of them are really niche, I guess. The most popular ones are Gnome with a hard G. That was a made-up acronym, GNU Network object model environment or something like that, but for the last 20 years they just call it Gnome. There's a software development group called KDE, which is cool with a K, desktop environment. And in the early days, the only software they provided was the desktop, so it was just called KDE. But over the last decade, they've come out with specific applications and stuff like that. So they've named their desktop environment Plasma, and it's fairly popular. XFCE, LXDE, and LXQT. And LX means lightweight, and I'll talk about those later. And like I said, there's many more. Enlightenment is one that some people like. So just to add to the confusion, if you put Ubuntu, which is very popular, on your computer, you'd get Ubuntu with the Gnome desktop environment. But if you installed Kubuntu, you'd get Ubuntu with the Plasma desktop environment overlaid on top of it. Or if you wanted LXD, a lightweight desktop environment, it would be Lubuntu, but recently they've dropped the DE and gone to Qt. And what that means is the original LXDE environment was based on the Gnome libraries, all of those software packages in the background to do the work that you never see. In the last number of years, they've dumped those and gone to the Qt libraries, which are the focus of Kubuntu, the KDE desktop environment. So basically, the new Lubuntu is kind of a lightweight Plasma, if that's not confusing enough. If you run XFCE, it's Xubuntu, I guess. And when GNOME went from their version 2 libraries to their version 3 libraries, it caused a lot of ruckus. And some of the old reactionaries didn't like it, so they stuck with the old GNOME 2 and made their own distribution. This called Ubuntu Mate. You can see the accent on the end. For years I thought it was mate, but then I was corrected. It's Mate. Fedora is another Linux distribution, and I think somebody's going to talk about why there are so many different variations of Linux, so many distributions. But Fedora is one that's quite popular too, and their default desktop environment is GNOME. But if you run Fedora with KDE Plasma like I've done, it's just called a Fedora KDE spin. They have a Fedora XFCE spin. You know, you get the idea. Naming is all over the place. However, if you loaded Ubuntu on your machine and you wanted to try Plasma, you do not have to overlay or overwrite or reinstall the Kubuntu version of Ubuntu. You can go into your Ubuntu package manager and say, install Plasma, and it will install Plasma, which will not replace the GNOME desktop environment. It will merely add it to your system. And on boot or on login, when you go to login, you can select which desktop environment you want to run. And you could install all of these desktop environments and play with all of them if you wanted. Anyway, some cute pictures. This is somebody's GNOME. It was out on the internet. And I just want to point out that all of these desktop environments are highly configurable. This guy likes icons on the desktop. He likes his panel on the left. It could be anywhere. And you can see on the right, there's a white dot and not a circle, a dark dot. That shows that he's got 2 virtual desktops. By clicking on that other dot, it would switch to another screen, which you could have a whole array of other icons and different background and wallpaper, all that. So that's GNOME. Here's Plasma. I grabbed this off of the internet. I started using KDE back when it was version 1.0, and back then they were emulating kind of the Windows 95 model with a start button down in the lower left. It's that kind of funky right arrow looking thing in the lower left corner. When you click on that, it pulls up a menu. I think they call it the start menu in Windows. And just above the start button, you can see something called favorites. That's the equivalent of Linux. I forget what they call it. The panel where you pin the things you like. I've stayed with Plasma pretty much through the years. And because I like it so much, here's my desktop. The reason the panel down at the bottom is so small is because it's a very high resolution screen, and so that they end up looking small. I don't like icons on the desktop because my running applications all cover them up. So I put them on all on the favorites menu, the start menu. Just a quick description. On the left are two different running versions of a system monitor. It's called G-Chrome. It may be available for Windows, but this is a Linux machine. The one on the upper left is monitoring this system. The one just below it is the server out in my ham Radio Shack. I'm a ham radio operator. It's a total geek from age 17. So anyway, ham radio is not just talking anymore. I manage a ham radio IP network, sort of like the internet, but running over ham radio frequencies in the 2.4, 3, and 5.8 gigahertz region. And I manage a number of hilltop network nodes spanning Ventura County and LA County in California. And in the lower left is a monitor, a ping monitor. It's monitoring some of the vital resources out on the network, and you can see they're all happy there. But the point is, it's highly flexible, and you can arrange all of these however you want. Here's Xubuntu. It has a narrow start menu down at the bottom, but there's expandable menus. Claim to fame is it's lightweight on hardware resources. Although the amount of resources you take is dependent on the libraries you utilize, and most of the major libraries are about the same in size, to be honest. Several years ago, somebody did a in-depth survey about how much RAM and CPU all these various distributions were using, and KDE Plasma was actually not much heavier than Xubuntu and Lubuntu, which is LXQT now. You probably can't, if you went to load Lubuntu now, you would get LXQT, not the older LXDE. That's been deprecated. And again, you can see it's got the customary panel down at the bottom and pop-up stuff. The graphics on the Linux distributions have gotten quite good. So, what kind of applications do you get? It depends. Like I mentioned, if you get a server, you won't get a desktop environment. But on the desktop, typically you'll get an Office suite. Most typically it's LibreOffice. KDE Plasma has their Calligra distribution, which Office suite, which has gotten quite good. And there are other standalones too, standalone applications, spreadsheets, calculators, stuff like that. Internet apps, Chrome and Firefox are available. And I want to mention that a lot of these applications that started out on Linux were later migrated to Windows. So if you're using something like LibreOffice on Windows, it's an easy slide over to LibreOffice on Linux. All the files are compatible. Same thing with your browsers, Firefox and Chrome. Audio apps, if you've ever used Audacity, it's a nice audio recorder editor. It's available for Windows and Linux. Video editors, there's at least 3 really good video editors on Linux, and at least a couple of them are also available on Windows. Now, if you're running a specialized distro like a rescue CD, like I mentioned, that you boot on, if your computer won't boot, it will go in and provide you with a set of tools to analyze and perhaps repair the disk, and if not, rescue your files. Pen testing is penetration testing. It's a CD or a DVD or a distribution specialized for hacking. Obviously, it could be misused, but there are a lot of companies who do nothing but penetrate, attempt to penetrate companies, and they're for hire. A company will say, see if you can get in from outside, and they scan ports, look for open ports, and stuff like that. And additionally, sometimes the companies will invite them to come in and lurk on their network and see what they find wrong. It's really a smart thing to do, and these companies are very, very sophisticated, as are the tools. Some of them are amazingly sophisticated on probing for vulnerabilities. Obviously, they can be misused. You can misuse a screwdriver to break in a house, but the white hats use them for testing. And there are when I started out on Linux, the desktop applications were far and few between. It was kind of grim, but that was 25 years ago. And since then, just thousands and thousands of applications are available. One of the ones I use the most is a genealogy database running on Linux. And because it's open source, anybody can look at the source code for any of these applications and take it and use it as their own. When the developers of the genealogy database were developing it, people were whining about there's no Windows version. They said, we're not interested. Those people took the source code, went over and ported it over to Windows. So now it's available on Windows, and that's completely legit. So I mentioned that it used to be really, really challenging to get Linux installed. And over the years, it got easier and easier and easier. Nowadays, it may ask you what your name is, what your password is, and how much of the hard drive can I use. And that's about it. You watch it install and you're done. And the nice thing about it is, even though you may not know much about Linux at that point, you can be productive. There's a browser, there's a word processor, you can play music and learn how to use it over time. And part of that using is managing it, installing packages and installing updates. Most of the popular distributions will have a little daemon, a little program that runs on boot, and it will constantly compare the versions of the packages you have installed on your machine versus what's the most current. And when it spots an update out there, it will alert you to it, and it will even volunteer to install it from you. And these updates are all from encrypted, password secured repositories. So you don't have to worry about agreeing to let this little program install stuff for you. If you want to, well, let me go here. The GUI, the mousy clicky interface, is very usable. Everybody's familiar with using a mouse. But if you remember the DOS days, if you go back that far, you can do a lot with the command line. And people might think that, well, Linux command line's got to be pretty intimidating. But if you remember, again, back to your DOS days, excuse me, there may have been 150 commands in DOS, but how many do you use on a daily basis? Maybe a dozen. Well, with Linux, there are probably tens of thousands of command line commands. How many do you use on a daily basis? The same dozen, and some of them are even named the same. So you can do a lot with the command line interface. They have GUI package managers, but you can also update and install packages from the command line. And since you can remotely log into a computer via Linux, you can update a computer that's nowhere near you. Yesterday, I updated a half a dozen Raspberry Pi computers that are on hilltops around here. very useful. So anyway, here's the Gnome package manager. I had to go out and get a picture of it because I don't run Gnome. And you can see they've gotten pretty sophisticated. And on my machine here, I run KDE Plasma, but I do all my updating via the command line. So I had not looked at their GUI package manager for years, literally, and it's gotten very, very sophisticated, very slick there. You should be able to find any one of a bazillion applications there. And you can find it by category. So if you're not sure what audio editor you want to use, you could click on the category and pick a few. Because it's open source, it's not licensed, you can try 3 or 4 of them, stick with the one you like, and just leave the other ones on your operating system or remove them if you want. Okay, I've got questions or comments, or I can do a quick show and tell. I think we were going to do that later though, Bill. I'm sorry,
Yeah.
John.
But it's either one that has the comments. I would like to kind of clarify in the questions and stuff that this is just an introductory area, and as you saw in some of his slides, we are going to be focusing on some of those in detail in the next few weeks. So we don't want to get too ahead of ourselves because we have whole presentations on installation and distros and all the software. So, you know, we're open to good general questions as we go through. So now we'll see if there's are some questions for Orv based on the overview of what Linux is, and after that we'll move on to Sharan's presentation. So I don't know if I have all the questions that somebody else has. So I'll ask Bill, did you get any through you?
I have one. I have one question.
Okay.
Well, I have well, actually now. For the convenient time, for any convenient time, I'm thinking of getting one or pen scanner for historical research away from home. Will Linux support these? I guess those handheld scanners.
I'm not sure what the question is about scanning.
This individual is thinking about getting a one or pen scanner for historical research away from home. Will Linux support these? I guess it's those handheld scanners that you use for genealogy that you come back and plug into your computer.
Oh, if they're USB, they're almost certainly supported, but you can just ask Google, give the name and brand and say supported by Google question or supported by Linux question mark, and somebody will have asked that question and answered it.
Okay. The second one is, could you please repeat your video editor packages?
I'm sorry, what was the question? You're cutting out a little bit.
Did you hear? I'm sorry. Could you please repeat recommended video editor packages?
John, aren't we going to cover packages in a later presentation?
Yeah, we're going to delve really into that.
Yeah, if you can hold off, we can go into that in great detail later.
This is Sharan here. I'd just like to contribute that at SEMCO, we did a series of video editors. There's actually about a dozen, and in the last 2 years, I was able to cover 7 of them during that course. So Orv is right, we're going to cover packages later, but if you like one on video editors, there's a ton of good stuff out there.
Anything else, Bill?
The last question I have is, I've tried Linux years ago and connecting a printer was a problem. Has there been, has this addressed with drivers?
In general,
I'll repeat the question.
In general, the answer is yes. You asked about printers. There's a vast array of printers that are supported. I will say that HP and Epson are very, very well supported. Those are the two most featureful, let's put it that way. But if you go to linuxprinting.org, they have a huge database of supported printers.
I've got a good one for you,
Or,
Orv. Okay. Go ahead, Bill.
the one I have, if you do not know DOS, can I use Linux?
Yeah, it's all GUI. You don't ever have to.
If I do not know.
You don't have to use the command line.
Yeah,
Did that answer your question?
That's it. You don't have to know DOS. You just mouse
That's
and
it.
click. Yeah. That was the same one I think I had.
That's all I
Okay.
have, John.
Okay. Orv, thanks for that good intro to general talk about Linux. And like I said, we are going to go in depth in the next 3, and that doesn't preclude that we won't be having more Linux workshops, because as we hear back feedback from people on what people want to know, we could have a 5th or 6th one after the first of the year. At this time, I would like to introduce Sharan and let him take over, and he's going to talk to us about, the benefits and why us Linux users, use Linux. So if you want to take over and share your screen and everything.
Okay, let's see. Can you see my screen here?
We're good to go.
Okay, let me admit a couple of people. Okay, all right. So, hello everyone. My name is Sharan Kalwani, and I come to you all the way from Michigan. And over here we have SEMCO. That's pretty popular. We cover all sorts of stuff. And we actually run 2 meetings at the same time, one on general computing, the first half of the meeting, and the second half of the meeting, we call it SIG Linux, or Special Interest Group Linux. And we talk about all sorts of stuff related to Linux, but we don't limit ourselves to Linux. We actually, dive into open source also quite a bit. But open source and Linux, they kind of go together. So what I'm going to talk about today is why would one choose Linux for a variety of reasons. Actually, some of those Orv has already covered, but I'll cover it from my perspective or add a little bit more depth to it. What you see on the screen up there is the official mascot for Linux, that little penguin out there on the upper left-hand corner. But like open source, if you don't like it, you can always morph it to whatever you like, which is why you see all these other variations of that same penguin. And, there are many more out there, but that shows you the spirit and diversity in Linux. And that's something I would say it's hard to argue against. It's kind of like going into a restaurant and you only have 3 menu choices, and go to another restaurant and there's a whole buffet, and if you don't like it, we have another floor with a different kind of cuisine and a buffet there. So that's the way I like to say, why would you choose Linux? Because nowadays you can find pretty much anything you want in it. But let me be a little bit more objective, or maybe perhaps present a management sort of view. I work in the corporate world, and often in the past 20 years, I was called upon to explain why should we go to Linux, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm drawing upon that to list all the reasons. And here's an outline of the reasons I would give. You can see on the screen: security, stability, maintenance, hardware choice, cost, privacy, community, and of course choices. But I arranged this in the sequence in which I knew my upper management would be kind of most interested. So I'm recasting that today for our benefit, for your benefit. By the way, if you notice on the lower right-hand corner, the IEEE, I actually belong to the IEEE, and so I've given this talk at the IEEE where we had a whole bunch of engineers who had to move from proprietary systems or other older systems, legacy systems, mainframes even, all sorts. And after giving them this talk, it was pretty unanimous that, you know, why didn't we move to it sooner? So let me share a little bit more about why Linux. So the number one reason that I found in the corporate world, or even in the personal world, I'm sure we all care about security just as much as the other guy. And even today, you hear all sorts of little glitches and issues. Orv talked about penetration testing. Despite all of that, somehow the bad guys are always able to get through. And they usually do it through computer viruses and computer malware. Looks like I got unmuted momentarily, but no problem. So where was I? Yes. So the bad guys usually are able to get through with computer viruses or malware. Well, here's a little good fact. Linux, if you use that, then automatically, or let's say not automatically, there's an extremely high probability that you can avoid those viruses and malware because they're often written for maybe Windows system or similar other, you know, Mac OS systems. And if you download them, they'll just be like a file there where they don't cause you harm. Because in Linux, lots of things out there, they have to know, okay, what kind of Linux you're using, where's what, and custom craft all of that. And even despite that, there's still a few barriers for them to overcome. So in general, Linux is a lot less, you know, prone to getting infected with viruses and malware, at least compared to Windows. Somebody did a count, and if in the Windows world, you had like 100 viruses maybe in a year, in the Linux world, there might be one, and it might even only affect one particular variation of Linux, and it was detected and stopped pretty early. So with that sort of overwhelming, you know, advantage, it was clear to folks listening to this that, well, we'll reduce a lot of our headaches. We don't have to face bad press. We don't have to worry about a lot of these things because Linux in general is a lot more robust. And there are many good reasons for that. One of the reasons is that the way Linux works is that there are two modes inside Linux. You have the kernel or privilege mode, and then the user mode. Critical files are all in the privileged mode. And if you, most of the time, 99% of the time, you log into your Linux box as a normal user. So even if you get some sort of infected file, in order for that infected file to do something, it has to acquire that extra special privilege, which we know in the Linux world as root, because root is the topmost user. And you can't just become root as a simple user. You have to go through a few manual hoops in order for that to happen. And so it stopped right in its tracks out there. So it doesn't change the system setting. It doesn't change the configuration. When that happens, then, you know, you're good. Whereas in the Windows world, they don't have that separation of concept of normal user and privileged user. And, you know, a lot of these things happen. So whenever I log into my Linux box, and I have a ton of them, I'm not really worried because a lot of things will get stopped right there as a normal user. And as root, well, we think many times, twice or thrice before we actually have to go in as root. And even that too is rare, and we found ways where we need to make any changes, but those changes are logged. Those changes can be undone quite easily. So we have several layers of protection. And so if you're just going to use Linux as your desktop box and browse the internet, you don't have to worry about your system getting infected or something lurking inside and then blowing up later. Now, despite that, there is actually software out there that can inspect your Linux system. It's called ClamAV, if you want to secure this. And again, I don't use it because I don't have to worry about this kind of thing. Even if I browse the internet, if there's a plugin that I have to download, this plugin has actually been checked, inspected, and you use it from a trusted source. So it limits a lot of things out there. Another thing, that Linux operating system itself and tons of software that run on it is usually open source, which means other people can look at the source program before it's compiled and made an executable binary. They can spot things like backdoors or hidden things, and they'll alert everyone. And then right then and there, people will not distribute binaries of that particular source, or they will put in fixes and distribute the fixes. That's the definition of open source. So I forget who it was who said, maybe many, many years ago, 1,000 pair of eyes is better than, you know, just half a dozen developers in a closed or proprietary system. So that is the biggest strength of Linux, is that because tons of people can check it, inspect it, and make sure that it's secure, we all get to benefit. And if there were any flaws that have crept in the past, somebody has spotted it and instantly let everyone know, and pretty soon everyone migrates to the more secure fixed versions or closing those potential loopholes. And we get the benefit of that many, many years right after that happens. Okay, so that was number one. Let me move to the next. The other thing which our end users of all our Linux server love, it's solid as a rock here. Okay, apologies to Ashford and Simpson. Every time I say that, it reminds me of that song. It is pretty solid. I wanted to actually take a screen snapshot of a few servers and show you a command called Uptime. And in ours, it runs in years. We have a server, once we boot it, I think most recent one that we got, we installed it in 2017 and it's 2020. It's been running for 3 years now. We have not had to shut it down or reboot it because we don't need to. It's not prone to crashes at all. And here's the best part. When we installed it, we take measurements, we run it, make sure, okay, all the applications, they're running fine. And then 3 years later, if we run that same application, it runs just as fast as the day when we installed it. And it was just Jim Dandy. But I think many of you have had experience with maybe other things like Windows. After a while, because of a variety of reasons, it starts getting bloated. I had that experience on a partner's Windows laptop, where she complained that, why is it running slow? So I looked into it and I found there were patches and cache, things that it remembers from past that had all accumulated in the temp scratch directory. So as a result, the hard disk had only a few gigabytes of space left. And every time they needed to update something, it would try to find free space on the hard drive. And it took such a long time to find. So I went, and it was a 1 terabyte hard drive, and I went and deleted about 300 gig. It started running faster. Well, that was Windows. On Linux, you don't have any such issue. It runs just as fast, patches are made in situ, and there's always a fallback. And scratch or temporary files are periodically cleaned up. So the uptime is high, and the availability, two different things, is high. It's easily in the double-digit 9%. And unlike Windows, if you do have a patch, you can apply the patch, and you don't have to reboot. This is often the case with Linux. You don't need this. Thus, there is a reason, and I think Orv alluded to it, the cloud server people, or if you look at the number of servers running on the internet, you can look at that link I've supplied out there. About 96% of the top 1 million web servers out there are running on Linux because they want their web server or website to be up all the time. People all over the world will look at it, poke at it, and it just runs. So the Linux itself is very, very solid. And there was another one, and I think I have a screenshot out there. The top 25 websites, they run Linux. 23 of them run Linux. And the other two out of the top 25 are live.com and bing.com, which is the search engine. They both belong to Microsoft. So clearly, even though Microsoft itself has started to allow Linux to live in their universe, these two websites use a Microsoft server to run their website out there. Here's another statistic on the stability, and Orv again alluded to it, so he stole a wee bit of my thunder. But in 2019, the last supercomputer on the top 500 list, this is a list that's published every 6 months. The next one is going to be published in November at the Supercomputing Conference, which this year I'm attending virtually. So my day job is I run high-performance computers, supercomputers. The current one I have is about 75,000 cores, simultaneously all running Linux. So these are the top 500 sites in the world. And I believe this is the 30th year of that publishing of that list. And even in those days when they first started it, they were using Unix. And then afterwards, once Linux appeared on the scene, and when they wanted to increase the hardware capability of the supercomputers, they would have to go to AT&T to get permission to modify Unix. But with Linux, they could modify it and make it run on their supercomputer within hours. You know, imagine a very powerful machine, and then you just download the source code, make the few changes, compile it, and you've got up and running. You don't have to ask mother, may I, and all that. So that's there. And then the cloud folks, what the cloud folks do, they have hardware. And then on that hardware, they run virtual servers. Most of it is actually VMware or things of similar ilk. If you were able to peel back the cover of VMware, you'll find Linux underneath. So they're all running Linux, all the solid cloud, your Amazon, your Google's. I had a statistic on which distribution of Linux Google was running, which one Amazon was running. Oracle has their own, they've got that. And even Azure, Microsoft Azure, a portion of their cloud also runs Linux. That's why I alluded to that they've started allowing Linux in the Microsoft world or universe. So let's move on a little bit. Maintenance. It's always a problem, you know, patch this, patch that stuff. And people might tell you, oh, Linux has got a problem. But you know what? They're talking about ancient stuff. Long time ago, at least 15 years ago, the Linux folks or all the developers or the open source community, they made changes, made suggestions which were put in, they contributed code so that it makes it very easy. Again, Orv alluded to it. So things like the Ubuntu people or the Red Hat people, the SUSE people, they've all made software repositories, and they've enabled automatic fetching from the software repository updates and things like that. You can do it on your own, you can automate it, or you can have the system do it. And all those updates are checked, rechecked, and tested out before they're placed out there. So that's why maintenance is it's just a snap. You don't have to worry about it. And again, you don't have to reboot. Do it whenever you like. And like I said, you can have it done automatically. I do it on my home personal Linux box. I have it inform me, and it says, oh, we have an update to the compiler, and it's about 25 megabytes worth of patches. So go ahead and do it. It does it, reports everything, and I keep working on my merry way. Nothing to worry about. And here's the other part. I've used Unix for a long time, so for me it was a natural progression to go to Linux. But what I discovered with Linux is people, because it's open source, they contribute things to it. So a lot of peripherals, devices. Earlier there was a question about handheld scanners, and yes, a lot of those are supported. It's easy to find, and for many, many devices for which Windows will ignore it or not work with it, most likely you'll find it'll work with Linux. Not only that, many people would ditch a lot of their old laptops, and I told them, don't do that, give it to me. I would take that, and then I'd run Linux on it. Linux works on practically many of the PCs or desktops or laptops out there, because by design, by cooperation, they've made it very streamlined and efficient. So it doesn't, eat up tons of memory or tons of hard disk or even the CPU power. You can run it on, ancient 386 based stuff, or any old Pentium that is still around. It'll install and run. And there are at least more than 100, 125 distributions out there, out of which a good chunk of them are lightweight, even more lightweight than Linux, in the sense that once they get the operating system in, then they just store the minimal amount of packages on it, so you can get started right away within minutes after doing that. So I actually have a bunch of laptops. One of them is dedicated for watching my home network. Another does file serving. Another one, I can hook up different printers to it. Plotters, you remember those, flatbed plotters and things like that. So I can use them, and they serve well, and I save it from landfill. And so, as mentioned, Linux now runs even on embedded systems, little devices that are out there, like clocks, watches, and things which do fancy stuff, to supercomputers. So I like this because, and you might find it a reason if you have a machine that, they'll say, well, we won't run Windows 7 on it or whatever because it's too ancient. That's great. Wipe it out, put a Linux distribution, and you can use it for web browsing, word processing, let your kids or grandkids play games on it and stuff like that, and feel a lot more secure. And you've given new life to hardware as well. Oh, and I don't know, Orv, did you mention this? If not, I'll mention it. It's free. You don't have to pay, indirect license costs to Microsoft. If time permitting, I might sneak in a joke there. But Linux itself is free. You don't have to pay any licenses. Tons of software is out there. Lots of educational software is out there. And there's things for desktop publishing, photo editing, audio editing. I think Audacity was mentioned. Photo editing, GIMP is there. And there's many, many, at least dozens of those. And video editing, which I've done plenty of those video editing tools. It's kind of cool. And because it's very light on hardware usage, it actually seems to run faster than video editing software that you pay hundreds of dollars for on the Windows box. Yeah. Oh, one other thing, the privacy aspect. Yes, You might already be aware that Windows 10 does all sorts of telemetry on you. It tracks what you're doing, what programs you're running, what websites you're visiting, all sorts of stuff. Well, Linux doesn't do that. However, people will bring up the Ubuntu, canonical Ubuntu, where it actually would tell Amazon that, oh, this is the website you're doing, so that Amazon might, put in an ad. But it doesn't collect any personal information like Windows does. This is just the ad, and you can opt out of it. So as far as I know, all the other Linux distros, they don't have this issue. And again, this thing you can turn off as well on the canonical version of Ubuntu out there. And then community support. Yes, in the old days, we actually knew the early days, all the Linux developers, there were just a handful, maybe 25 of them, maybe 25, 30 years ago. But today, it's in the hundreds and thousands. There are people in the same boat. They've encountered some of the same problems you have, and they actually do something about it. They fix it, and they share it because they believe in the open source movement. And that's what Linux has benefited from. And because there's a variety of tastes, usage, people have created distributions where, like Orv said, you take the basic free Linux operating system, add maybe your choice or selection of, desktop application programs, and you've got a distribution. Maybe in a future talk, we'll talk about DistroWatch, which tracks what are all the distributions out there. If you're into computer security as a security professional, there's a Linux distribution which has bundled programs that allow you to check security. There's a Linux distribution that comes already pre-packaged, bundled with a lot of video editing software like AV Linux. There's Linux distributions out there that have already gone through the headache and put together packages which has lots of educational software on it, so on and so forth. Time permitting, or maybe in the next event, we'll go to use DistroWatch and introduce you to all of those Linux variants. They all serve a purpose, and you can always find something that suits your tastes and need. So if anyone has any questions, I think John mentioned to me, make sure you put your email as the last slide. So with that, thank you for listening, and maybe I can take a question or two.
Very good information, because I think that those of us who do use Linux, you covered the real reasons that we use it. Now, of course, my #1 reason is it's free. That's why I'm free, John. Bill,
that's the cost. Yeah, I put that somewhere in the middle because management, didn't worry about cost. They would say, give us security, give us stability. Yeah, they're willing to pay for that. And then when we say it's free, by that time it's a no-brainer. Absolutely,
for us old retired people. Bill, did you catch any questions for sure?
I only have one question. I'm not sure who to address it to. The question is, if I have LibreOffice installed on Windows 10, I need also to install it in Linux.
So LibreOffice is available on Linux, so no problem.
That's good.
The other question I have is, will anyone...
Okay, we lost you again.
Bill, you cut out here.
I'm sorry. Will any how to install Linux as a dual boot?
Yeah, that's next session. Is our whole big focus is doing the installation. So we will save that for our main feature, because that takes a long time. But yeah, we'll cover all of that stuff next time.
Well, I've given you plenty of reasons to certainly dabble or try Linux. And if that has intrigued you, then you should show up next time when they'll talk about, John will tell you when they'll talk about how to install maybe a particular or two distributions. Let me stop sharing, then maybe John, you can put up that schedule you had for future talks.
Yeah, we'll go over it because that's on a rotating slide, so it'd be, you know, can't quite catch it, but it's in the schedule that we sent out too. That's good. I think if that, since that was all the questions I saw too, that was a lot to put into your head. But once you get that into your head, I think you'll see the value of Linux. I'm going to finish up my part with a short presentation, which kind of comes from a non-technical side. So I'm going to start sharing and then use my little tricky keyboard to move to a different virtual desktop. Now, it jumped because my mouse hit. With the other guys, you don't have choices. And my son kind of taught me the phrase IIWIS. It is what it is. You have no choices. But if you go, you stop doing that. If you go with Linux, you have choices, unbelievable choices. And this isn't even all of them. And some of them, I think, are also no longer there, and we'll talk about that in the future. So I get the question a lot. Stop doing that. Why are there so many versions of Linux? Because people who come from the Windows and Mac world, you don't have any choices. You just have Windows and you have Mac. So they asked me, why are there so many Linuxes? And I ask people, well, why are there so many versions of cars? Think about that. Why do we have so many cars? Well, in the beginning, they were all too much alike. Everybody kind of drove the same looking car that was pretty much the same as it came off the assembly line. And people didn't quite like having the same as everybody. It's almost the same as chili. Everybody has decided they don't like somebody else's chili and they can make a better chili. And so we now have these big, huge chili cook-offs, and everybody says, here's the better one. And the thing about, as you've heard today, we know the code, or I call it the recipe for Linux. And so anybody can take the chili and spice it up however they want. And we have lots of chilies. We have lots of Linux. Cars have choices. You know, we go back and we talk about the big car makers. And of course, it started with the big three, the General Motors, Ford, Chrysler. But even within those three, they had choices for their divisions. General Motors got crazy and had 5 different divisions. Ford, Chrysler only had the 3. And people who know the General Motors from back then know that, in a sense, the cars were built for economic levels. The people who had the least amount of money possibly would get the Chevys. The people who had more money got the Cadillac with all the frills. If you were a middle of the road person, you probably got an Olds. If you're somebody who wanted the Cadillac but couldn't, you got a Buick. And Pontiac came out with more of the sporty models. Ford did the same thing. Lincoln was their top of the line. Mercury was right under that. Chrysler, same thing. We also have other dealers or manufacturers such as Honda and Toyota, Subaru, VW, and these are not just, you know, American design cars. They've come from all over the place. And there are those who have come and gone. Now, when we go back and we look here, we see that General Motors got rid of Olds, then they got rid of Pontiacs. So now they're down to 3. More manageable, maybe? I don't know. I had demands for those cars. Chrysler has gotten rid of the Plymouth and just keeping the Dodge and Chrysler. You know, Honda, they still have theirs. And a lot of people, I think, weren't aware that the Honda had their Cadillac version and Lexus. But, oh, back with the General Motors, I had a car, it was a Pontiac. There were 5 versions of that one car, all the way from a Chevy version clear up to a Cadillac version. Slight changes because people want choices. Linux has choices as well. The 3 original manufacturers, Slackware, Debian, and Red Hat, people said, well, I like what Slackware is doing, but I think I can make it better. I like what Debian is doing, but Ubuntu said, we're going to make some changes. Mint liked what Ubuntu was doing, but said, you know, we can make some further changes and make Debian better than Ubuntu better than Debian, and Mint better than Ubuntu. Red Hat came out, and Fedora, obviously a Red Hat. I do have to point out that there is, you know, because Sharan said it's free, and yes, Linux is free. But what we do have is Red Hat Enterprise Linux. And this one was designed especially for business. It has a cost, but the cost isn't for Linux. The cost is for immediate tech support. And so businesses say, we want somebody else taking care of things. So they get the RHEL and pay for the support, not for the Linux. Linux has other choices too. There's another one, Arch and Gentoo. And again, people said, well, I like what Arch is doing, but, and we have different ones, Manjaro, Arco Linux. Gentoo is one I haven't even looked at because it's kind of a geeky one, and there have been created ones on that. And again, in the Linux world, like in the car world, they've come and gone. And why? Because these are community, individual people who are creating this. Things change in people's lives. Car manufacturers, for some reason, General Motors said, we don't want to build any more Olds or Pontiacs. And we have some developers who say, my life has changed. I can't devote the time to working on this Linux, so it just disappears. But what's really nice is that there are some people that said, I'll take the ball and I'll run with it. And so a lot of times we'll have the not original creator of a Linux distribution still maintaining it, but somebody else. Or somebody will take the old Linux, change the name, and they could go along with it on their side. Now, cars have models because we all don't like just that one Model T shape. And over the years, you know, we've had these sedans and 4-doors and station wagons. Oh, I loved the station wagons when I was growing up. We had big hunky vans and nice small sports cars. Amazing, though, we're really going to a world of SUVs and minivans now. But this is because people had differences. When a young couple got married, they got that 2-door small sporty car. It worked for them. But as the families get bigger, they had to have bigger cars. So we have choices. You know, if you have a big family, you can't go in a smart car. There's no room for you. So we have options. We have choices. And as Orv kind of mentioned, and we're going to go into this in big detail in 2 meetings, we have a lot of desktop environments. And this is more than just taking Windows and moving your taskbar around or something. You know, this is a lot of different designs. And why do we have so many? Well, Orv said, somebody said, I like what they did with Gnome 2, and they stopped doing it. We like it, so we're going to create that and make Mate. We even have people that says, I don't like anything that they're doing, and so I'm going to build things myself. And so we have a few desktop environments that are very modern, kind of change things off. Choices. And if I were to say, what's the one, I hate to use the word worst, but what's the worst thing about Linux? Too many choices. The first thing a Windows person or a Mac person does is they go through the problem of too many choices because they've never had choices before. So we tell you, you have choice. You can stay in line, take whatever's coming next, or go your own way. Get out of line, go have your own choices for what you want. I'll just go ahead and do the next one because then we can end it up. The question comes up, well, then who is using Linux? And as Orv showed you, and as Sharan, there are a lot of uses of Linux that you don't know about. And so people ask me, well, who uses Linux? And I tell them, are you ready for this answer? Because the answer to who uses Linux, you do. All of you sitting out in our virtual room, you have used Linux without really knowing it. And I'd like to share how many times you've been using Linux. Anybody ever go Google? Using Linux. How about you've been to McDonald's, ordered a Big Mac? McDonald's uses Linux. We've had a lot of people just take care of the big Amazon Prime days. You order from Amazon, you're using Linux. And those of you who post and read on Facebook, you use it. APCUG has a Facebook page, so APCUG is using Linux. Ha ha ha, didn't know it. Anybody ever order Omaha steaks or know somebody that did? That corporation uses it. In Ohio, we have a lot of Burlington industry stores. They've been using Linux for a long time to run their system. And how about all those people that have used some of the travel arrangement? Travelocity is one that's basing their systems on Linux, as well as Pizza Hut. United States Postal Service. And it's not Linux that slows them down. Nope, it's got it probably better. How many of you have used airplanes? The FAA, get that right, makes use of Linux to control and monitor and make things safe. Now, personally, I don't have a lot of money in stocks because I'm a retired teacher, but the New York Stock Exchange and Wall Street, they are using Linux to keep track of all those transactions and stuff. So you've been using Linux. And my favorite, because I have a son involved in this at times, if you've been watching movies where you know that they've been talking about the computer generated images, CGIs, most of the big movie companies that are creating those are using Linux to do all that designing. Smartphones. The Android smartphone If you have one, you're actually using Linux because Android came from Linux. And I will say too that if you're using an iPhone, you don't realize it, but iPhone and the iOS is another branch off the Unix system. So, you know, Apple and Linux are kind of cousins. Maybe Apple doesn't admit to it, but all your smartphones are using Linux. International Space Station up there in the sky is powered by Linux. And the federal court system, all of their records and all of their doings are stored and kept on Linux systems. And this is for one of our advisors who's a retired naval submarine. The subs, the ships are using Linux to control them. Even the PlayStation, the gaming system, uses Linux as its base to play all of its games. NASA, since we also know that they do that, is using Linux as their background. And then the thing that's amazing is they'll tell you right now that the power that you have in your cell phone, your smartphone, is more than what they had to fly to the moon. But they've been using Linux. And of course, as Sharan said, the 500 supercomputers, or the top 500, and the webs. If you're using the internet, doing any kind of work, most likely you're using Linux. And the big key one that comes out, Microsoft. Even Microsoft is using it for their Internet of Things. So if you've ever done any of this stuff, you've been using Linux. You're just not to the point where you're using Linux on your desktop for all the reasons that you were shared. Tux Digital is one of my key resources for technology news for Linux. He's designed a shirt that says it all. You can't see it, but Linux is everywhere. Now I'm going to kind of end up my section with talking about why don't you see Linux? And the first number one reason is money for advertising. You pay for Microsoft, you pay for Apple. They've got loads of money that they can invest in advertising. Linux is free, so if it's free, where are they getting their money for the big advertising? They don't. Word of mouth is what was getting Linux around. Businesses talking to businesses about how secure Linux was for their work. But the everyday home, you don't see advertisements because TV advertisements cost a lot of money. You get that through presentations like this or presentations from our Speakers Bureau. They don't cost you anything, and you can get the word out about Linux. Another reason why you don't really see it, I call it the Office waterfall. And I'm basically talking about the Office software. And Microsoft got businesses hooked on Office, whatever year you want to go back to. And so businesses were using that because that's what came on the computers, and that's what they did. Universities then said, well, if in the business world our graduates are going to be using Office, we better be using and teaching Office. And then the university was doing that, and then the public schools said, oh, wait, if our high school graduates are going to university who's using Microsoft and Office, we better be using Microsoft and Office. And then, of course, it falls back down at home. Well, the schools are using it, then we should be using it. But the schools could be using Linux, but because of this waterfall effect, when I was teaching and I had middle school, I was a tech coordinator for that, I moved our whole building of 200 and some computers to the grandparent of LibreOffice. It was called Star Office at the time. I moved it to there because it was free and we didn't want to have to pay. And so we moved to that, and it was amazing. It wasn't a couple months before all of a sudden I received in my mailbox a huge packet of flyers to send home to the families, offering a fantastic deal on getting Microsoft Office at home because they knew I wasn't using it. Waterfall effect, it comes from the top down. And the last part of the why deals with the manufacturers. Microsoft has paid the companies like Dell and man goes blank, I'm getting old, to put Windows software on the computers. So when computers were bought off the shelf, that was what was there, Microsoft, Windows, and people just used them. Now, Apple went their own route and said, well, we're not going to pay anybody else to put our software in that. We're building our own. And if you want our software, you have to buy our hardware. Linux, well, they don't have money. So how are they going to pay the companies to install operating system? Well, nowadays, that is changing because people are seeing the value of Linux. And so now we have companies that are strictly building Linux computers. One name at the top is System 76. But this has also caused some major brands like Dell and Lenovo. They are now including Linux as an option when you buy a computer from them. So the future is changing. It's coming out there. But the problem is you don't hear about it enough because there's not a lot of money for publicity. So people like me and Sharan and Orv, we do it. We try to get the word out that way. All right, so we'll stop the sharing. And so I think at this time, let's see if I can do it. Try to do it from this way. I'm trying to get it to let people unmute.
You can't. You can mute them. They have to unmute themselves.
Well, right now they aren't allowed to unmute themselves.
I clicked on unmute themselves.
That's why I put you as the co-host. Thank you. All right. So as we do in the other ones, I look at the clock and, oh, good time. I was planning it would be done with the presentation part. So now we're open for discussion and questions in general. If you have your camera on and you have a question, you can always, raise your hand and we can see you. If you don't have a camera, the best way probably is to pop a thing in the chat and say, I have a question, because we can see that on the participants list. And then once we know you have a question, we'll call on you and you can unmute and stuff. And Judy, feel free to pop in when you see somebody that I might not see, because
I have a statement as usual.
Oh, okay.
Back in the day in the elementary school district where my kids go, when they went 4 doors up the hill, Apple gave every classroom an Apple computer. And my son's 3rd grade teacher was an adamant Windows user. And he said, I'm not going to do this. And he brought in his own Windows computer. To this day, that school still has an Apple lab. There is not one other school in the district that is hung on. Everybody else has gone to the Windows platform. And high schools and junior highs have gone to Chromebooks. They do still teach Office, but the kids all are using their own Chromebook, because when the pandemic hit, we made sure that all 23,000 kids in the high school and junior highs had their own Chromebook at home. So for us, it's a dual world, and Apple is not included, but they do have an Apple class at the high schools that the kids can take, and the design things and stuff like that. So in my area, we're using the 3 different OSs, so to speak.
Yeah. Okay, I've got one question, then Sharon's next on the batters up. There was a question about how compatible
I have 3 questions when you finish.
Okay, all right. And this is a beauty one. I just love this one. How compatible is Linux with Windows files? With a USB, there is no problem with Linux. Linux reads just about everything. It's the software. LibreOffice reads all the document stuff, including Microsoft files. The same programs read all the video files. Everything is common. There's been really nothing that's a problem. In fact, the biggest thing is that with Linux, Linux can access Windows, and Linux can get files. We use Linux when we are salvaging or trying to repair damaged computers, because Linux can read Windows files without even requiring a password. So I was, for a while, when I was dual booting, I would create files in Windows, open it in Linux, create files in Linux, open it in Windows. So it would be a very specialized file that would be any kind of a problem. Another good question coming up, and I'm going to direct that to somebody else. So I would say no problem with files. Now, there is a problem with a few companies that do not make programs that will work on Linux. That's a different story. But USBs, you plug them in, they go. Printers, you pretty much plug it in and it goes. So that's good. Okay, Bill, how about tossing some of the ones you have?
All right. If I have an old Windows PC where the operating system is long expired, how do I determine the best Linux distro for this PC's limited hardware and performance, or lack thereof?
Okay, I'll tell you right now that in 2 meetings, not the second, the third meeting, that's going to be Sharan's big presentation, is choosing the right Linux for you. And there's a whole bunch, but not really getting into it right now. But he's going to do that. I don't want to spoil his spoil alert. But that's going to be in 2 meetings, and we'll definitely cover, out of all these, how do you decide what to use?
Second question is, are tutorials available for new Linux users?
Orv, how about you?
Yes, there's a ton of tutorials out on, as you would imagine, YouTube. I can't point to any specific ones, but if you just search Linux tutorial or Linux and then some special topic like installing, I don't know, whatever it is, GIMP or something like that, or actually tutorial on Kubuntu, or a tutorial on Debian, or a tutorial on Raspbian, which one's on Raspberry Pis, you'll find a ton of information.
And the next question is, can Linux be installed on a Chromebook?
Yes, there is, I couldn't point you to it, but just search for how to install Linux on a Chromebook. And I know there's at least several tutorials out there. They've recently streamlined that procedure, but not having a Chromebook, I don't have any details on that.
And I think this question is kind of in the same ballpark. It's my question is ASUS notebook with a ARM processor?
There are Linuxes that run on ARM. Raspbian is. Again, I would say Google it. I know that, Ubuntu with the most current release now supports ARM processors. They have a flavor of their distribution that supports ARMs. I just saw that come across yesterday or the day before. That would be 20.10 version of Ubuntu. I don't know what their code name is for it, but go to the Ubuntu site or search for Ubuntu and ARM. It's
something to do with Gorilla, Glory Gorilla maybe, or something like that. They name that. Yeah, and as Sharan pointed out too, there are so many variations of Linux. There's got to be one that's going to work for you. We'll just talk about that later. Go ahead, Bill.
The individuals come
for the ARM.
The individuals come back.
Just a second, Bill. Sharan, go ahead on the ARM.
Yeah, on the ARM, there's actually a distro called RISC OS, RISC-OS, that has been around for a long time and works on all ARM processors.
See, there it is. Go ahead, Bill.
They've come back with another, but I think you've answered the question. To Ubuntu 20.04, or you said they.
Yeah, you're really cutting out a lot with that Wi-Fi tonight, with so many people on there.
Okay.
We'll try. Make sure you save your chat and send it to Judy so that she can gather questions for the team. I've got one under here that I need to answer and then let somebody else do it. That somebody says they understand that Linux will not run Thunderbird. Well, I'm going to have to disagree because I'm using it right now. You know, Thunderbird is running on Linux. I've been using it for years. Now, what's happening is the development of Thunderbird is not all the way at the top, and that mainly is because most people are going to web-based. There is not going to be a need for Thunderbird to be a client-based software like we used to have with Outlook Express. So Thunderbird does work with Linux, no problem. It just may not change a lot. But the other question I'll let Sharan or Orv ask is about the issue about something software like with Quicken and TurboTax that do not run on Linux. Either one of you want to jump on that?
Well, I don't use those packages, but I do know that a lot of the Linux, what are they, money management programs will import packages like that. I'm trying to remember, I played around with them 10 years ago, and they've advanced obviously tremendously since then. I would just say try it. Install it on Linux, import your stuff, and see if some of them are dual accounting, is that what they call them? And some are not, so pick one that suits your needs.
Yeah. Sharan, since you pointed out in your presentation part, one question said, since we're all this open source, why don't hackers go in and make viruses?
Because they'd only be hurting themselves. They use Linux themselves for development and then port it over to Windows, because Windows is still a big part of the computer universe. And who was it that said that's where the money is? Because it's so easy to exploit Windows, and you can make a lot more money because people have too much invested in that they'll pay anything to get out of that jail. So that's the reason. I mean, these hackers are businessmen too. Why go after Linux where it's already tough enough, and you won't install a binary, and there's privilege barriers to cross? when Windows is easy picking.
Yeah.
Hey,
He also
John, I have a few comments on that too.
absolutely.
Because Linux, well, any software under the general public license, which is what the most common open source license means, the source code is available for inspection by anyone. That doesn't mean just the hackers. It means all of the programmers who work on Linux and the associated packages. And you'll see a continuous stream of patches for Linux. In general, let's say 85% of them are enhancements, 5% are for bug fixes, things that don't work properly, and the remaining few percentage are security issues. And what happens is a programmer will be banging around in the depths of some program, and he notices that, you know, for this program, if I submit this piece of data specially configured in this way, I might just possibly be able to crash it or something. And they will patch it and they will submit it as a security fix, even though it's so obscure, there's no known exploits. So it's continuous improvement. Additionally, they have automated QA programs for software looking for not only bad coding, but vulnerabilities. And all of the software is scrubbed routinely, and it's gotten very, very secure. Now, a lot of the exploits you hear on Linux are because someone has installed an application, a web-facing application, and they've left the admin password at default. Very bad practice. And that's all I have to say about that.
Yeah, I think that's the thing about it, is it's so open that if they do something, it's going to be found right away, because as you said, there are thousands and thousands of people who have nothing better to do than just to read code. And I'm glad of that. I'm glad they do that way. Sharon, how about you? You've been patiently waiting.
Thanks, John. My question, I have a Sony Vaio laptop gathering dust because it had Windows 7 on it, and Sony was out of the business and didn't support keeping it up to date. I couldn't guarantee that transitioning to Windows 10 was going to work with it. So I just treated myself to a new laptop. Now I'm thinking I can put Linux on that for my grandkids. So I'm not sure that this is a question, but I hope when you get to addressing install, you'll tell us how to get rid of all the old Windows stuff that's on there, so my grandkids aren't looking at my financial records or whatever I have on there.
Yeah.
So,
Or
Hey,
go
John,
ahead.
can I address that one? Yeah, please.
That's your thing next week or next time.
In general, if a computer has enough RAM and a reasonably new CPU, Linux will run on it. If you pick one of the really, really high-end distributions to put on a really old computer, it'll run, but performance will be leisurely. So you have to set your expectations. I would say a minimum of 2 gigs of RAM, and I think everything has a SATA drive now, but just as a side comment, if before you put Linux on that old machine, take the rotating disk drive out of it, pound it with a hammer so you don't have to worry about your Windows applications and files, and buy a cheap solid state drive, put it in there. That gives every computer a new lease on life, regardless of the OS you put in. And we'll talk about that more.
Yeah,
I'm going to suggest that I also have had a Sony Vaio laptop, and I put Puppy Linux on it, and it worked. So there's Puppy Linux, there's Anti-X, there's Tiny Core Linux. Tiny Core will run in as little as 12 megabytes. I mean, there are lots of choices. Maybe, John, in the future, we could have a special edition of installing Linux on old computers.
Yeah, we'll see how far Orv's going to cover. But I'll just comment that when I retired, I got my first laptop. I always have been a desktop person, and my laptop was bought in 2008, so we're talking over 12 years old. It's still running because I put a lightweight Linux on it, and it's doing fine. It's not a speed demon because its processor is 12 years old. It's got 4 gigs of RAM, which is all it can do. But here's a 12-year-old laptop that is still running. And I think if we tried to take a 12-year-old laptop and put Windows 10 on it, we might have some issues.
One more comment.
Sure.
Linux will run on pretty much anything, but you might not find the performance of the applications you want to run fast enough or suitable enough. Some of the high-end, obviously video rendering or audio editing, you wouldn't want to pick an old machine for that. So you choose your hardware appropriately for the purpose.
Yeah, I was going to recommend old laptops or old computers. I use it for one dedicated purpose. For example, a print server. So the printer itself is, takes a little time to print out the page, but it's not a problem for the old laptop. Or you can use it to, browse or word processing or something like that. For the kids, learn typing or read a page or two. Again, as you correctly pointed out, keep that in mind that old computers, whatever you remember you were able to do with it, just about, then use it for that same purpose. But you'll save it from the landfill out there.
Yeah.
May I say, I put in a link in there. This is Murray, if I may. And I found this fascinating thing that made me wish I hadn't taken my old dead laptop to the recycling. It's about 10 or 15 things you can do with all the parts from an old laptop. And I wish I'd kept that because I would have tried some of them. Some of them are really, really neat.
Gee, Judy, that sounds like a good topic for a presentation at a future VTC.
All right, get in touch, okay?
Yeah. Go. Yep, go.
Okay, back to tutorials. Many user groups have a subscription to lynda.com for their members as a benefit of membership in their group. They have Linux tutorials. You can also check with your library to see if they have a subscription to lynda.com. And if you have a library card, you can take any class your little heart desires. And udemy.org, which is another, of course, it's paid, but has excellent tutorials, and they also have them on Linux.
Yeah. My other comment to Sharon is that Sharan pointed out, and I've pointed out, and everybody in Linux points out, it's free. So that means that you can try a version of Linux. If it doesn't seem to make that laptop work right, there's a different one to try, and it doesn't cost you anything, as opposed to buying something and finding out afterwards, oh, I've spent money and it won't work. With Linux, you can just try, and you'll find something to work for you. Other comments and questions that people might have? I'm trying to see if I can see anybody. As a review, a reminder, next meeting, which will be on the 18th of November, the week following James's third installment of the home automation for seniors, we'll be focusing on where do you go to get Linux and the whole thing about installing and how you can test out Linux without doing anything to your own computer and see how you like it. Our meeting in the 2nd of December will be how then do you decide which Linux do you want or which is the best for you. There's something else on there. And our fourth one for this first phase on December 16th is going to be talking about software like crazy. We're going to spend the whole time talking about what's the best software for Windows people to use to make the transition to Linux, what's the best software for anything out there, alternative software, getting software, managing software. It's just going to be a hard afternoon of software. So those are the ones coming up. Now it hit me. See, getting old. On the other session, we're going to be talking after we talk about what you used to make the decision on distros. We're also going to then talk about a lot of these different desktop environments. And the hope is that we will get a number of people, and so if anybody hearing my voice, to talk about their version of the desktop. You heard that Orv said he's a KDE guy, and I'm kind of an XFCE guy. And what we may try to do is get a number of people to demonstrate and show, what they like about the different desktops, so that you can get an idea of what you might like, since there are so many out there. So those are our workshops coming up, plus the 2 final workshops for Bill James. And as Judy would say, because I sometimes can think in her head, if there are any kind of other workshops that you think would be interested to our members, just let us know, and we'll try to find somebody, like we did for the Linux and like we did for password managing. That's kind of a benefit of the club. So if you have ideas and suggestions, just get them off to her, and we'll see about putting on other workshops. We think that our Wednesday workshop is kind of a good time. Judy?
And don't forget what's happening tomorrow, John.
Final installment of the Bitwarden help desk night. And of course, I will also say that in next Saturday, a week from Saturday, will be the VTC. We've got 2 great presentations on track 1 and track 2. And our annual APCUG board meeting with all of you people invited. It's free. And we'll be meeting at 3 o'clock. The state of the APCUG itself, reports on all the regions of what's going on, and I'm excited about my report. And we'll have election of officers for the board of directors and the advisors, and announcing the winners of our contest for this year. They had a big time, lots of different things to look. So we've got awards to get out and all that sort of stuff. Judy.
If you want to be one of the participants with a different kind of Linux, would you please send me an email? You've all got my email address 16,000 times. And Murray, whose chat box did you put your link in? No answer to that.
I put it into Bill James.
Okay, who will definitely download his chat for me. Thank you so much. Edward, unmute yourself. You've got a question.
Yeah, I saw one major distribution said they're going to move toward 64-bit only. Does anybody think that 32-bit is going to go away eventually?
I think for the most part it is, because 32-bit operating systems for computers haven't been coming off the market line for years. But Linux being Linux, there will be somebody that will still run and create a 32-bit for a while longer. But
I think
go ahead.
I think in my in my Asus my Asus notebook, the ARM processor, it says it's actually a 64-bit processor, but I think that at least some of those machines back then, the BIOS had the 64-bit operation not enabled, and I've been trying to find something that would tell me how to enable it, but I haven't so far. Basically, my problem is that when I try to run, if I load up a live CD for any of the later versions of Ubuntu, it once it gets past the try the Linux, then I get a black screen, and I'm not sure. I know that one of the laptops I had at one time had a problem that when I had to do something in the startup script because the screen was black because it didn't turn on the backlight for the LED So anyway, I'll keep pulling it. The one I'm going to try next is Sparky Linux, which at least has the 5.6 kernel. I'll see if that works.
Yeah, I would say, give either a try to the Antics, or I'm using MX. Works well. I had a same little bit of a problem with a very unique processor on this old laptop. It's a 64-bit operating system, so I can run 64-bit things, but I can't do a 64-bit VirtualBox. I have to run I have to run 32-bit virtual boxes, but I'm running a 64-bit install on my operating system. So, it's the processors, and we've got so many different versions, and they try to work. But I think, again, keep trying. There's going to be one that's going to work, better. Judy.
Oh yeah.
Art, will you please unmute yourself?
Okay, to you Linux bigots out there, and I don't mean that in a disparaging way, are you, as far as I know, there is no Zoom client for Linux. Are you all running through?
Yep. Go ahead, Judy.
Yes, they're running it. John runs it just fine, but Zoom is working on it.
So
No,
you're
actually, I take that back. Isn't there one, John? Because you worked on this when we as APCUG first got into using Zoom.
Yeah, I have a Zoom client, but I'm running it through the browser. But I have Zoom. If I click on it down here, I don't want to do it right now. But it's one of the things that I don't need a Zoom client, because I go right to the web and log in through there.
I'm using the Zoom client.
Yeah.
And they just released an updated version. It's I think it's at feature parity with the Windows client now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I didn't check to see if I had it updated, but yeah, there's definitely, if I go to my application menu and I go to internet, there's a Zoom. So yes, it does have it.
So you're running in the client and not running in the browser.
I'm running on the browser, Orv's running on the client.
Okay.
They're working on the same thing for Chrome books. But when we first went over in 2014, that was John's task. He was to hound them to get them going with Linux, because they had absolutely nothing. And we are relentless.
Yeah. Anybody else have anything? I hope this has been beneficial. This has been recorded. If we can match up your screen name with the email in the registration system, Judy will be sending out the actual video if you're interested in it. We'll also have any questions that didn't get quite answered today, but again, a number of the questions are going to be answered in these next few sessions, because I'm excited about how much material there's going to be, and I think that we'll find out that there's going to be more topics that need to go. So unless anything else, I'm going to thank Orv Beach for being here and Sharan to be here, and they'll be with us in the next few sessions with our topics. Thank you, Bill James, for helping out. Hope you get your power back thanks to all the ice you got in Oklahoma City. Judy, as always, thank you. So see everybody next month for Linux, tomorrow for Bitwarden, next Saturday for VTC.